The repeated sound of a hoof slamming against metal echoed throughout the empty void. Twilight's hoof fell sharply against the metal barricaded door of the farmhouse. She was desperately begging for it to just open up. She didn't care if some horrific abomination in the distance heard. All she wanted was to know that Applejack was okay, that she had made it in safely into the barn before the world had shifted around her. Somewhere in her mind, she had already known that trying to find Applejack here would be futile. And yet there she was, slamming her hoof against a metal door, praying for some kind of response from inside. Clang, 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 clang. With that final strike of her hoof, the metallic door gave way. The empty air echoed loudly with a groaning crack, followed by the hollowed crash of steel hitting steel. Twilight panted as she turned to look at her work. The farmhouse now open for her to investigate. Her hooves throbbed with pain, most likely now bruised from how hard she had just been striking the metal door. A part of her didn't care how damaged her body became anymore. It didn't really matter in this strange world anyway. But the other half of her mind, the part still desperately clinging to logic and hope, told her she shouldn't hurt herself too much. With a deep breath, she turned and slowly walked into the darkened farmhouse. No light slipped through the covered windows or from the door, and just the desolate remains of the house that once belonged to the Apple family. Twilight tapped the pendant around her neck, and it lit up once again, revealing just how much damage had actually been done to the house. No longer were the walls made of wood and wallpaper, delicately hanging pictures of the beloved Apple family and friends. The house was no longer filled with the simple wooden furnishings that lined the hallways and rooms that gave it a warm, lived-in feeling. No rustic charm, no simple decorations, absolutely nothing that belonged to the Apple family that once lived there. There was nothing but cold, harsh, rusted, metallic walls lining the hallway. Thick sheets of steel lined the floor, layered with ash, rust, and what looked like splatters of blood. The house was now deathly silent, any remaining ponies having been there even moments ago, long gone. Her hooves echoed dully against the thick slab of metal beneath her as she headed for the living room. The comfortable furnishings of the house were also gone, now replaced with either absolutely destroyed remnants of tables and chairs, or horrifically designed structures meant to cause great harm to a pony. Grim chains hung from the ceiling, blood splattered various parts of the floor, and the walls were lined with sharpened objects. Applejack's living room had turned into a torture chamber. The only thing that had eased Twilight's mind was the simple fact that no pony actually appeared within any of the devices. They were empty and unused. Her dim light swept across the room, looking for even a partial trace of the ponies who might have been there before that horrific siren had blared. But all she found was ash and blood. Leaving the awful room behind, she headed for the dining room next, hoping that she wouldn't turn her stomach any more than this world already did. The dining room was empty and silent as the rest of the house was, but it was free of any horrific imagery that stained the rest of the world. The table that spanned its length only had empty plates scattered across it, signs of metal and a meal having been prepared but long since forgotten. Why doesn't this make any sense? Twilight let out a growling, frustrated cry. She raised her hoof up and swung it at the long-since grayed dish on the table, sending it flying straight into the wall. It crashed violently into the wall, splintering into several tiny pieces that scattered across the ground. Why? Why do you keep separating me from my friends? Why do you keep showing me these horrific scenes, followed by these calming scenes? Her horn lit up, and the table before her became enveloped in the glow of her magic before being tossed across the room. Plates went flying as the wooden table splintered and cracked, crashing with immense force into the wall. Twilight panted heavily, her body shaking as her mind tried to find a single thought to concentrate on. She fell, sitting on the cold steel as her back hooves ached and throbbed. Her mind ran circles in her head, and the cold air cooled her heated skin. I just don't get it. Twilight closed her eyes, trying hard to think about what was happening. Is there something I'm missing? Something that ties everything together? The monsters, the scenery, this whole world itself. Am I missing something? She hated herself for not knowing the answer, but she hated the world even more for not giving it. She'd lost count of how many times she'd nearly been killed this day. How many times she'd just been hurt or lost. How many times she thought she was reaching the end to this insanity, only to be dragged back deeper into it. Someone, anyone, please. I need a clue. Twilight's tail curled around her legs as she sat there, eyes shut, just trying to keep back the tears once more. Every time she'd given in to believing, into hoping that things would be better, they were just as quickly tossed away. She'd just lost count of how many times the world had made her break down to question everything that she was doing. Anger still boiled down inside of her gut, pushing at the depression that was trying to take her over. The memory of what Magus had just showed her in the barn surfaced in her mind once again, and she felt a new wave of anger reach her. Her resolve was settling back in. It was just a small reminder that she couldn't give up now. She had to continue. The sound of something striking the metal floor made Twilight nearly jump out of her skin. She was instantly on her hooves and looking behind her, expecting yet another one of the world's abominations to emerge from the shadows. But the air was silent as ever. Only the shadows were looking back at her. Twilight stood there, frozen, unsure if it was a distraction or something coming to attack. Her medallion was still silent, so whatever the sound had been, it didn't seem like it was an enemy. Her eyes shifted to the floor, noticing there was something new behind her that hadn't been there a moment ago. A small golden key placed on top of a folded piece of paper. Twilight examined the key, not noticing anything of importance, before opening the piece of paper. I know things are bad right now, but I believe in you. You only have a little further to go, and you'll save every pony. I found this key. Follow this map to the door, it most likely unlocks. Don't wait too long. This world doesn't like waiting for too long. Your friend, Pinky. Twilight mouthed aloud at the end of the note. Right below the note was a crudely drawn layout of the town, with a line going through it, leading to a circled X. Pinky left me this note? Twilight pushed thoughts of what the note had said aside for the moment, and looked down the hallway where the broken back door still lay in pieces. She quickly ran outside and looked around. However, the darkness that covered the town was now only giving her a limited view. If Pinky was somewhere out there in the dark, she'd be no guaranteed way of seeing her or going after her. What does this mean? Why did she give me this but not even drop to say hi? Twilight asked aloud, more just airing the question than seeking an answer. She hovered the paper in front of her once more, reading it to herself again. This world doesn't like waiting for too long. Those words felt ominous to her. They said a lot with so little. Somehow Pinky knew the laws of this world, something that had managed to elude her all this time. Everything made no sense, and yet Pinky had made some sense out of it. Somehow the idea didn't seem all that ludicrous. What baffled her the most, or perhaps scared her the most, was the idea that Pinkie Pie had found a way to save every pony here, perhaps even bring an end to this horrid world. But if such a place existed in this world, then why hadn't Pinkie already saved every pony? Why hadn't she gone there herself and brought every pony to safety? Was it because she needed magic in order to save everyone? Was it something only Twilight could do? Twilight hadn't focused on it too much, but the thought and idea that every pony else was trapped there, going through the horrific mazes and monsters that she was, had crossed her mind. What if that was the case? Then she wasn't very special at all. There were plenty of unicorns in town that could provide magic. There were plenty of ponies who had the strength or knowledge to fight and save everyone. If they all fought together, even this world would seem small in comparison to the veritable army. It was an idea that was quickly dashed away as it had come, just from the realization that every pony she had met today had been alone. Alone, separated from the others, and traveling through this horrific world on their own. Despite how many ponies were in Ponyville, every single one of them was alone right now. And any time she met any pony, in a matter of minutes she had been separated from them. And that seemed to be the one constant thing in this world. You had to be alone. Perhaps that was why Pinkie Pie hadn't said anything. She just came, dropped the key for Twilight, and then left as quickly as she'd come. If that was truly the case, Twilight wished she'd at least written a little more on the note. Perhaps an explanation as to why Pinkie couldn't save everyone, or how she'd managed to find Twilight so easily, or even a simple, "I'm okay, just keep going." All she knew was that Pinkie somehow gave her the note, written in that usual jumbled mess that Pinkie called writing, and that she was gone now. Twilight let out a soft, frustrated sigh as she looked at the map that Pinkie Pie had scribbled onto the note. It took her back into Ponyville. This time, it had her heading to the center of town. The area circled with an X on it had to be City Hall. "That's halfway across town from here," Twilight murmured to herself, remembering the route to town from Sweet Apple Acres. However, getting across the town was bad enough, just trying to avoid the soldiers that seemed to surround any pony every time one spotted them in town before the transformation. Not to mention, there was this looming possibility that the dragon flying around the town might come down and start attacking her as well. But now the world's look matched the hell it created. There was no way of knowing how safe it would be to get to the center of town. Pinkie knows that if I go there, I can save every pony. I can only trust that she knows what she's doing, Twilight said, taking a deep breath to help reassure herself. She then began to walk away from the abandoned farmhouse that was once Applejack's home and headed into town. The cold steel beneath her hooves let out a dull thud with each step. No matter how far she walked, the ground was of the consistent, rusting metal that seemed to stretch out in the darkness around her. The only light came from the pendant glowing around her neck, extending her vision to a short distance in front of her. She passed by what used to be the Sweet Apple Acre trees that it was famous for, which were now only twisted poles of metal covered in what looked like slowly pulsing flesh. It was stretched almost unnaturally taut around the tree, with what appeared to be a bit of muscle underneath that would occasionally break through the skin. On top of every tree, the jagged metal pole seemed to turn into a cross. Twilight stopped and stared at one of these trees, examining the oddity of it. The way the trees were placed seemed odd, even for an apple orchard. They were all uniformly placed around, the same distance between each other. The cross at the top of each tree was very similar to the ones that she had seen winter withers attached to. Only, these felt different, as though they were placed here in remembrance instead of as a warning. A cold shiver ran down Twilight's back as she turned away from the tree she was studying. She continued her trek down towards the town, trying to push the thoughts of the book to her mind now. She needed to focus on getting back to the town alive, and from there, getting to City Hall alive. Her gut shifted uneasily, knowing the new key inside of her magic reservoir would only lead her to more trouble, and she no longer had any of those magical health drinks to help her. The only thing she had for self-defense was the last remaining book in her reservoir, and she wasn't about to rely on it for bashing away monsters. She stopped. She noticed the path in front of her suddenly becoming to abrupt end. She blinked as she looked down what she could only see as a bottomless chasm where the floor had once been. The direction she had been walking in was the most direct way back to town, but it looked like the ground only gave way halfway on her trip back. Had the town been swallowed up by an infinite abyss? What was the only way to get back to Ponyville? The note had said that she needed to get to the town, but there was no path that was going to let her head that way. For all she knew, she could very well be on the only piece of land left, floating above a sea of nothingness. Furrowing her brow, she looked to her left and right. Either direction could possibly lead to an answer, or just lead her to being more confused and lost. Something in her gut was telling her that the town was still there, but the world was going to make it difficult for her to get back there. Letting out an annoying sigh and turning to the left, she started walking that way on the grass. She followed the edge of the bottomless pit, occasionally looking back at it, wondering how far down it went. It was a distraction from the fleshly metal trees that surrounded her on the other side. Her mind kept wondering about the bottomless chasm, about things like what could have caused it, or how it had affected the town, or why it was there in the first place. Beneath the surface should be more rock and earth, but she couldn't see anything way down below. She stopped for a moment to ease her curious mind. Lighting her horn up, she grabbed hold of the edge of a nearby metal branch. She tugged on it for a moment before the rusty metal snapped away from the flesh tree. Holding it over the empty chasm, she let it droop and opened an ear to listen. A moment passed, then another passed, followed by another and yet another. No sound whatsoever came back, letting her know that the metallic twig had hit some kind of bottom. It was either too far down, or the sound wasn't loud enough to echo back up the way that it had come from the emptiness. If she was back home, back in the normal world, she figured she might have wanted to study this phenomenon more. But the only thing she wanted now was to get the world back to normal. Continuing to follow the edge of the chasm, she noticed that her medallion hadn't buzzed in quite some time. She wondered if somehow, just maybe, in the transition from the fog world to this overworld, she had entered one that had no monsters in it. The town was far too quiet for its own good, and it was starting to grate on her mind. There was no wind, no bugs. Even the trees that looked like they had a pulsing beat going through them didn't make a sound. The only sound she could hear was the clopping of her own hooves against the metal ground. She was alone. She felt desperately alone, like there wasn't even a single soul anywhere nearby. She picked up her pace of walking, wanting to find a new path, a path to the town. She wanted the comfort of seeing Ponyville again, even if it was the lonely, boarded-up remains of Ponyville. She wanted to feel wind. She wanted to know that the world still felt like it existed. She was alone. All that returned her to the silent loneliness of the trees. She stared at them as she passed them, the perfect aligning trees, passing without a word, each one marked with that cross at the top, each one just pulsing in time. If she turned her gaze away, all she would see was the bottomless, empty pit, where absolutely nothing could be. She was alone. Her hooves struck the ground, and the metal clacked loudly, but the sound barely echoed. She was alone. She picked up into a run, trying to escape, trying to find something. She was alone. She had to escape. She had to get somewhere. She had to escape. She had to get somewhere. She was alone. Twilight's terrified cry rang out as her hoof hit the metallic root that had sprung up through the metallic floor. Her body hit the ground hard and she tumbled forward a bit before landing hard on her side. She let out a stifled groan, feeling a twinge run up the side of her body. She groaned as she tried to sit up, her mind wondering just how many times she'd just been crippled over in pain since she'd been here. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes, trying to calm her racing heart. The soundless air around her was playing tricks on her mind, and she just needed to keep focused. Get to the city hall. That's all she needed to do. Her eyes opened back up, and instantly she noticed something that hadn't been there before. Right next to her was a metal bridge that crossed the bottomless ravine that had appeared between the farm and the town. "A way across?" Twilight asked, speaking into the void. She got up to her hooves and began to examine the bridge. It didn't appear to be held up by anything from the ravine, extending forth from the metal floor she was already on. It certainly hadn't been there when she fell over, but there it was, clear as day. She looked at it suspiciously before carefully placing a hoof down on it. The metal gave a small creak, but seemed to hold steady. She put one hoof at a time on the bridge, going slowly and carefully across the creaking metal. It wasn't very wide, only wide enough to fit maybe 2 ponies, and there were no side rails. She took several deep breaths to try and calm herself, maintaining the rhythmic 1, 2, 3, 4 of her hooves across the bridge. One wrong step, and she could easily plummet into the abyss, and who knows what might happen to her then. Twilight felt pressure brewing in her throat and swallowed it down, just concentrating on the task at hand. She looked forward and continued to slow her trek across the bridge, hearing the creaks and groans of it bearing her weight as she walked. She only blinked once. She saw at the sight of the end of the bridge, land that connected the bridge from Gravel Acres to Ponyville. Relief slowly washed over her, but she maintained her slow walk. Her hooves landed on the other side, and she let out a deep sigh, tension leaving her muscles. She was closer to getting to City Hall now. All she needed to do was head into town. That was what she kept telling herself. Just focus on getting to City Hall. With her composure regained, she stepped forward, only for her light to illuminate a pool of blood right before her. Frozen at the sight of the crimson liquid, she quickly looked up to find the source. Another large wooden cross, impaled into the metallic wooden floor, oozing blood from the owner nailed to it. A unicorn with a snow-white coat and fiery red hair. It was once more her childhood schoolmate. "Moondancer!" Twilight yelped, running forward. "No, not again! Moondancer!" she cried out, looking towards the nails that were driven through the unicorn's hooves, looking for a spot to grip with her magic and bring her down. "Twilight." A quiet murmur spoke, and Twilight nearly froze. Her head turned to look up at Moondancer's face, seeing the girl with eyes barely able to stay open, but a gentle smile on her face. "Twilight, you've made it." "Hold on, Moondancer. I'm going to get you down from there. You'll be all right. I promise." Twilight's horn lit up, and she grabbed hold of the spikes holding Moondancer to the cross. She pulled hard, slowly removing them one by one. Moondancer didn't seem to flinch at the pain of the items being removed. She just let her hooves fall limp as they were removed, before collapsing from the cross and into Twilight's hooves. "I've got you! I've got you!" Twilight said, laying Moondancer on the ground so she could rest. Twilight ran her hoof across Moondancer's face, removing the hair out of her eyes and wiping away some of the blood that was stained on it. "Twilight," Moondancer spoke quietly. "I'm glad you made it here. I didn't doubt you would. You always managed to achieve what you set out to." Moondancer coughed violently, her whole body shaking. "Don't talk! I'll get you medical help." Twilight lifted her head and looked around, seeing nothing but the rusted metal and darkness as far as her eyes could see. Somewhere. I know there's help somewhere. You just have to hold on." "Twilight," Moondancer wheezed. Twilight could only stare at her childhood friend, who was now gently smiling back at her, despite how much pain she must be in. "It's all right. Sometimes ponies die." "No!" Twilight yelled, feeling the tears forming in her eyes. "No, they don't have to die. Not like this." Twilight's shoulders shook as the hot tears began to stream down her cheeks. "Not like this. Not as a warning for me. You didn't have to die like this." "Look at you." Moondancer chuckled softly. "Crying over little old me. And here I thought you didn't like me." "What?" Twilight stared, shocked at the unicorn that was withering away in her hooves. "Why would you think that? I never hated you. You were my friend." "Because you were always by yourself, Twilight." Moondancer gently shook her head, closing her eyes and keeping them closed. "I would invite you to parties. Try to spend time with you. Try to introduce you to more friends. And all you did was stay in that dorm of yours. You always studied. You never spoke to anyone unless it was a question. You never seemed to have time for fun." Twilight's mouth hung open for a moment. She closed it and tried to speak again, but no words came out. She grit her teeth, feeling her tears continue to stain her cheeks. She shook her head, lowering it closer to Moondancer's. "I didn't hate you, though. I just..." Twilight sniffed, trying to hold back her sobs. "I just thought it was more important. I had responsibilities. I had things I had to do. If I didn't..." I disappoint every pony." Twilight looked at Moondancer's face, as Moondancer slowly opened her eyes once more. Twilight could see the dulling blue color in her eyes. She was fading, and fast. "I never hated you. At school, you were the only one of the ponies I thought of as a friend. No pony else even came close, but I kept myself alone, because I thought I had to." "You were never alone, Twilight," Moondancer whispered. Twilight stared at her, watching as she smiled a little wider. "And you never will be alone, even if I don't see anyone around right now, even if it feels like no one cares." One of Moondancer's hooves slowly began to raise, though it shook as though it took great effort. She raised it and gently placed it against Twilight's chest. "They'll always be here. Your friends." Twilight stared at Moondancer as her eyes closed one more time, and her hoof went limp. Her eyes widened as she watched her friend give her last breath, before finally turning still. "No. No! Moondancer!" Twilight shook her shoulders a little, trying to get her to move. "Moondancer! Moondancer!" Her friend was as silent as the air around her. Twilight grit her teeth and closed her eyes, pulling her friend closer to her. Her tears fell faster down her cheeks, just letting herself mourn the loss of her old friend. This vile world had taken away not just her closest friends now, but even ones from her childhood. It wasn't fair. She'd never done anything to deserve any of this. Sure, she had been a lonely child, but she'd found friendship later in life. All she'd done since then was be happy, and try to make her friends happy as well. She'd never hurt anyone. She'd never committed any severe crime. She'd done everything anyone had asked of her. So why was this happening to her? Twilight let out a few more quiet sobs, her breathing slowly starting to normalize. She remembered the note and the key that still lay tucked away inside of her, and realized she had a mission to accomplish. She still had to go save every pony. She rubbed her face and opened her eyes, being greeted with a pale orange mane. Twilight's eyes shot open as she stared down at the mare in her hooves. The mare was a curled orange mare with a paler orange streak going through it, and a yellow-green coat. She was stained with blood in the same way Moondancer had been, and the evidence of her having been nailed to the cross was still present. This wasn't Moondancer. Junebug? Twilight murmured. Shock had settled in that the mare she was holding wasn't Moondancer. Does this mean Moondancer wasn't real? An illusion? Her mind felt turbulent once more. The world was messing with her mind again, but this time felt so different from the others. The world had screwed with her by changing the land, horrific monsters, or just savage, strange visions. But this had felt real. It felt like Moondancer had actually been right there. Twilight gently placed Junebug's body on the floor, taking a step back from it. Though Moondancer had felt real, it didn't change the fact that now Junebug was there before her, dead, killed in the same way as Winter Withers had been, same way that Sparkler had been. Twilight remembered Junebug well. While she didn't sell flowers, she maintained them all around the town. She made sure the insects weren't ruining them, made sure that they had proper water and soil, replaced them when the old ones started to wither, and was more than willing to help ponies as well as plants. She was also a mother. Her little girl, Peachy Pie, would be turning 9 in the fall. The two of them would often be seen during the weekends walking around town together as mother and daughter. When the two of them would settle down for lunch, and Peachy would tell her mom about how school was during the week, and the plans she had with her friends, and how much she couldn't wait to grow up to be just like her mother. Twilight grit her teeth, lowering her head as the memories of the wonderful mare filled her head once more. "I'm sorry, Junebug," she whispered sorrowfully. "I'm sorry you were used this way. Used to get to me. Used just to hurt me." Twilight stared at the harsh, rusted metallic ground before her. Her eyes stared at the rotting brown and red color that saturated the surface. But I'm going to save everybody else. I'll save your little girl. Don't worry. Just... Twilight swallowed a little. Just rest in peace. With those words, Twilight turned to face the cross, the wooden structure staring back at her, almost mocking her. The words of Merlin she had read sprang into her mind once more. If you broke their laws, invaded their lands, or offended their nobles, the fate of death was brought to you. You would be seen by those you knew and loved, by your enemies, and by your goddess, that you were an example of their power. The loud crack of the wooden cross echoed loudly through the darkness. In the emptiness that surrounded her, she figured that something so significant would be the loudest in this world. Her magic brought the heavy wooden structure crashing down hard into the metal floor below. She splintered wood, scattering from the forced break. Twilight panted as her magic faded once again. It exerted a lot of magic to break such a thick structure, and she needed to be careful of how much she used. In this world, being without magic was as good as a death sentence for her. She stepped over the fallen cross and continued ahead. The warning the execution gave her didn't cross her mind. She knew she was walking into danger, possibly death itself. But too many ponies had already died. Too many had been made to suffer at the hands of this world. If Pinky's message really meant she could save every pony, then she was going to do it. As her mind found its determination, she noticed that the outskirts of town had finally come into view. She slowed her pace a little as the metallic structures rose from the ground, barbaric reconstructions of what the town looked like in the normal world. No building had signs or billboards, no windows or cardboard, no signs of life having lived in them. Just giant buildings, made of rusting metal, stained with spots of blood. All of them felt more like cages than houses. Twilight felt a shiver run up her spine. The town just felt wrong. Ponyville was never meant to look like this, never meant to be like this. She had to make her way to City Hall, and fast.